From the time of emancipation all the way up to the middle of the 20th century, parts of our country were segregated. One of the many results of segregation was that black children were not allowed to attend schools with white children. Then, in 1965, President Kennedy put forward and Congress enacted the Civil Rights Act. This outlawed discrimination against African Americans and women, including all forms of segregation, including in schools. This meant that states could no longer declare that children of different races could be placed in schools according to their race. So by 1965, publicly funded elementary and secondary education was available free of charge for all children in our country, regardless of their race or income. However, this did not mean that children went to schools that, even though they were separate, were equal. This is because states at the time were allowed to put their funding dollars for education in the schools where they chose. And it meant that generally the funding, went to schools with majority white children, leaving schools in poor, rural, and black neighborhoods with precious little. This changed in 1965. In 1965, Congress enacted the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. The children of low-income rural and minority families were the primary target of the provisions of this bill. The act aimed to provide for their long-term welfare by improving their schools and the resources available to them. In 1965, when this act became law, there was a large achievement gap between the schools with the rich children and the school with the poor children. This act aimed to close this gap. The purpose of the funding is to increase test scores and encourage academic development so that these children may have the means to escape poverty. However, the school must demonstrate a willingness to improve the quality of education for its students and must prove this through measurable means such as improving scores on standardized tests. There have been many reauthorizations of the bill, most notably in 2001, when the bill was given the name No Child Left Behind, and the attainment of more detailed and higher benchmarks were established. So since the enactment of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, the power of the federal government to oversee education by using the power of the purse strings and the disbursement of aid vital to keeping the school running has dramatically increased. Schools that fail to meet federal guidelines, they may lose their funding. The debate over the use of standardized tests as a measure of quality of education and its impact on available teaching time outside of test prep and administration continues today. So by 1975, children of all ethnicities and all socioeconomic backgrounds could attend public schools subject to the standards set in place by the government. This meant that elementary and secondary educations were beginning to become equal for all children. However, some children were still left out. Children with disabilities were provided with a separate and at times unequal education away from their peers. To address these inequalities, Congress passed an act in 1975 known as the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. This act has been reauthorized several times and revised. It's now known as the Individuals with Disabilities Act. The purpose of the act is to protect the rights of children with disabilities by ensuring that they have access to a free and appropriate public education, just like all the other children. Schools are required to provide special education in the least restrictive environment. This means schools must teach students with disabilities in a general education class. when at all possible. It means that teachers have the added responsibility to meet the needs of all sorts of students, offering differentiated lessons taking into account a children's special needs, and offer accommodations if necessary. As a teacher, all of these changes in educational law are important to me. They mean that I must reach out so that I can train myself to work with children who have needs I was not trained to meet in my teacher training. Sometimes these needs are great, and sometimes I don't have others with better training to help me. This also means that if I work in a public school, I will be responsible for achieving learning outcomes that may not be reasonable or even possible, or else the school may lose federal funding. As a teacher, all of these responsibilities can be very overwhelming. And then I think of this child. She's a minority. She's not in a high socioeconomic group, and she has a learning disability. She's my child. Then, I'm grateful for the protections offered to her through the advancement of these laws, and I'm also glad that her teachers and school administration are accountable for providing her with a high-quality education. So I try to remember this when, as a teacher, that I am overwhelmed. And I do think, ideally, the government's essential oversight of the schools at the secondary and elementary level means that children, no matter who they are, where they come from, what their ethnicity is, what their abilities or disabilities, what special gifts and challenges that they carry within them, they will receive an education that is free, equal to their peers, and of a high caliber that will enable them to meet the challenges of life and work in the 21st century.